What if the next 40 eyes, Alif 40, Mashrais, Arspoin, in 8 hours decide the future of the Middle East, the global oil market, and maybe even the world economy? Because right now, Yofamitis and Da and the N, Nostral, Yelfai Zao, Yosterias, America and Iran are standing at a point where one wrong move can trigger a chain reaction nobody fully controls. And no, this is not about fake World War III tomorrow headlines. This is about real military positioning, real diplomatic pressure, real oil routes, and real geopolitical calculations happening in front of us. In the last few days, tension around the Strait of Hormuz has exploded again. American naval operations increased. Iranian commanders issued warnings. Oil tankers were attacked. Global markets reacted instantly. And behind closed doors, emergency negotiations are taking place. So the real question is not, will war happen? The real question is, what exactly are both sides trying to achieve in the next 48 hours? Because if you understand that, you understand the entire game. And that is what we are going to break down today. Not emotionally, not politically, strategically. First, we need to understand something very important. America and Iran are not behaving like two countries preparing for a full invasion. They are behaving like two countries trying to avoid total war. Why a walk to no sir, walk to a no sai, a no and you other why, while also refusing to look weak. And that creates the most dangerous kind of situation. Because history shows us something. Many wars don't begin because leaders want war. They begin because nobody wants to back down. Right now, the center of this crisis is not Tehran, not Washington. It is the Strait of Hormuz, a tiny waterway, but one of the most important locations on Earth. Almost 20% of global oil passes through this route. Think about that for a second. One narrow maritime corridor controls energy flow for Asia, Europe, and the and much of the global economy, which means whoever controls Hormuz is as influences oil prices, inflation, shipping costs, stock markets, and political pressure across the planet. And Iran knows this very well. That is why Iranian military officials recently warned American forces to stay out of the area. At the same time, the United States launched maritime operations to escort commercial ships and secure shipping lanes. Now look carefully at what this means strategically. America is trying to send a message. We will guarantee freedom of navigation. Iran is trying to send another message. You cannot isolate or pressure us without consequences. And in the middle of these two messages, the world economy is trapped. Now here's where things become extremely interesting. Publicly, both sides sound aggressive. But behind the scenes, both sides are also negotiating. Reuters reported that a temporary agreement is being discussed to reduce tensions and avoid escalation. That alone tells you something critical. If both countries truly wanted immediate war, diplomacy would already be dead. But diplomacy is not dead. It is fragile. Very fragile. And that is why the next 48 hours matter. Because this period is not only military, it is psychological. America wants pressure. Iran wants leverage. Neither side wants humiliation. And when nations reach this point, perception becomes more important than reality. Look at the language being used. American officials talk about deterrence. Iranian officials talk about resistance. Both sides are speaking to multiple audiences at once. America is speaking to allies in the Gulf, to Israel, to oil markets, to NATO partners, and also to domestic political audiences. Iran is speaking to regional militias, to its own population, to China and Russia, and to neighboring Gulf countries watching very carefully. This is not just military theater. This is strategic signaling. And every missile movement, every naval deployment, every statement is part of a larger negotiation. Now let's talk about what could realistically happen in the next 48 hours. There are basically three possible scenarios. The first scenario is controlled de-escalation. This means both sides continue showing strength publicly, but quietly move toward a temporary understanding. This is probably what global markets want most. Why? Because investors hate uncertainty more than anything else. The moment traders believe Hormuz remains open and oil supply is safe, markets calm down. And we already saw hints of this. Oil prices dropped after reports of possible negotiations and reduced tensions. But here's the problem. Controlled de-escalation requires discipline. One accidental strike, one miscalculation, one aggressive commander, and the entire situation changes overnight. That leads to the second scenario, limited military escalation. This is actually the most realistic risk right now. Not full war, not invasion, but targeted attacks. Naval clashes, drone strikes. Cyber operations are eifrig, and that's zero. Economic pressure. Proxy escalation. Why? Because limited escalation allows both sides to project strength without crossing the line into total war. And honestly, this is how modern geopolitics works now. Countries fight in layers, financially, digitally, through proxies, through sanctions, through shipping routes, through intelligence operations, sometimes without officially declaring war at all. And if limited escalation happens, the was the biggest immediate impact will probably be economic. Oil spikes, shipping insurance rises, energy markets panic, inflation fears return globally. Asian economies feel pressure first. Europe feels energy anxiety again. And emerging markets suffer the most. That is why the world is watching Hormuz so closely. Now the third scenario, this is the one everybody talks about emotionally online. But very few understand properly. A large-scale regional war, can it happen? Technically, yes. But strategically, it is still unlikely in the immediate term, because the cost would be enormous for everyone involved. America understands that another massive Middle East war would drain resources, create political backlash, and destabilize markets globally. And Iran understands that direct prolonged war against American military power would threaten the regime itself. Gulf countries fear economic collapse. China fears energy disruption. Europe fears another inflation shock. Nobody truly benefits from total regional chaos. And that is exactly why diplomacy still exists in the background, despite all the aggression. Now, here is something most people are missing completely. This crisis is not only about Iran. It is also about global power competition. Because whenever America is distracted in one region, other powers observe carefully. China watches American military commitment. Russia watches NATO attention. Energy markets watch supply security. Even countries like India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Pakistan are calculating how instability changes regional influence. In other words, masma aziu and matmortem. Iran versus America is never just Iran versus America. It affects the entire geopolitical chessboard. And this is why every statement suddenly moves markets. Every military ship becomes global news. Every negotiation rumor changes investor behavior. Because the world economy today is deeply interconnected. Now let's talk about media narratives for a moment. One of the biggest problems during geopolitical crises is emotional exaggeration. Social media rewards fear. Algorithms reward panic with zeal, R&D. Creators push dramatic thumbnails saying, World War III has started. Nuclear war incoming. Right? 48 hours left. News and South match. But serious geopolitical analysis does not work like that. Real analysts focus on capability. Intentions. Strategic incentives. Not of days and that's no. And diplomatic channels and enduring. And if we look at those factors honestly, the picture becomes clearer. Yes, tensions are extremely serious. Yes, military risk is real. Yes, the next 48 hours is drawn and that 48 hours matter. But there is still a major difference between escalation and total war. That distinction matters a lot. Now let's analyze the military side briefly. The United States still has overwhelming conventional military superiority. Carrier groups, air power, missile systems, naval logistics. Global intelligence infrastructure. Iran knows this, which is why Iran's strategy historically focuses on asymmetrical pressure. Missiles, drones, regional proxies, maritime disruption, economic pressure points. Iran's goal is not to defeat America conventionally. Its goal is to raise the cost of confrontation so high that direct conflict becomes politically painful. And honestly, that strategy has influenced global calculations for years, especially around Hormuz, because even temporary disruption there affects oil instantly. Now, another important question, why are negotiations still difficult if both sides want to avoid major war? Simple. Because their demands fundamentally clash. America wants limits on Iran's military and regional activities. Iran wants sanctions relief and strategic independence. Both sides want security. Both sides distrust each other deeply. And decades of hostility cannot disappear in a few meetings. That is why even temporary deals remain fragile. Now here's the deeper reality most people ignore. Sometimes geopolitical crises are not solved. They are managed. That may sound strange, but it is true. The objective is often not permanent peace. The objective is preventing uncontrollable escalation. And that may be exactly what we are witnessing right now. Managed confrontation, pressure without collapse, tension without full-scale war. But again, this strategy only works until somebody miscalculates. And history is full of miscalculations. That is why military hotlines exist. That is why intermediaries exist. That is why countries like Oman, Qatar, Pakistan, and others sometimes become quiet diplomatic bridges during crises. Because communication during tension is not weakness, it is survival. Now let's talk directly about the next 48 hours. What should people actually watch? Number one, movement in the Strait of Hormuz. If shipping disruptions increase significantly, markets react immediately. Number two, official military statements, especially from Pentagon officials, Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders, and regional allies. Number three, oil prices. Oil often reacts faster than politicians. Markets usually sense escalation before headlines fully explain it. Number four, diplomatic language. If both sides continue mentioning negotiations, that means off-ramp options still exist. If diplomatic language disappears completely, danger increases. And number five, proxy activity across the region. Because regional militias and allied groups can rapidly expand tension beyond direct US-Iran confrontation. Now here's the final thing I want you to understand. Geopolitical crises are never as simple as social media makes them look. This is not a Hollywood movie. It is a high-stakes power struggle involving economics, military deterrence, political survival, energy markets, and and global influence. And in situations like this, emotions are dangerous. Analysis matters more. Right now, the world is watching to see whether pressure turns into negotiation. Or whether negotiation collapses into escalation. That is the real battle happening in the next 48 hours, not just missiles. Not just warships, but leverage, psychology, timing, and strategic patience. Because sometimes the most important battles in geopolitics are not fought on battlefields. They are fought in calculations. And at this moment, America and Iran are both calculating very carefully. The next 48 hours may not decide the entire future of the Middle East. But they could decide whether this crisis moves towards stability, or towards something much harder to control. There's another dimension to this entire crisis that most mainstream discussions completely ignore. And honestly, it may become the defining factor behind every decision America and Iran make over the next 48 hours. This is no longer just a military confrontation or a diplomatic standoff. It is also a battle over endurance, influence, and the future balance of power in a rapidly changing world. Because when we look carefully at global politics today, we realize something very important. America is trying to maintain the international order it has led for decades, while countries like Iran are testing how much pressure that system can still handle. That is why every move happening right now carries symbolic importance far beyond the Gulf region itself. If Iran successfully pressures global shipping routes without facing overwhelming consequences, other regional powers around the world will study that outcome carefully. If America responds too aggressively, it risks pulling itself into another prolonged Middle Eastern conflict at a time when its strategic focus is increasingly shifting toward Asia and competition with China. And this is exactly why Washington's calculations are so delicate. American policymakers know military superiority alone does not automatically produce strategic victory anymore. The wars of the last 20 years changed that understanding completely. Modern conflicts are judged not only by battlefield outcomes, but by economic sustainability, political support, media narratives, cyber capabilities, and international alliances. Iran understands this transformation as well. That is why Tehran's strategy has never depended on matching American power directly. Instead, Iran has spent years building layers of regional influence designed to complicate any confrontation. From proxy networks to missile programs to maritime disruption capabilities, the objective has always been to create enough uncertainty that even stronger opponents hesitate before escalating. And whether people agree with Iran politically or not, strategically, this approach has forced global powers to take Iranian influence seriously. Now combine that reality with current economic conditions around the world. Inflation remains a concern in many countries. Energy markets are still sensitive after previous global disruptions. Shipping companies are already dealing with higher insurance risks in unstable regions. Central banks are under pressure. Investors are nervous about geopolitical uncertainty. In that kind of environment, even a limited crisis near the Strait of Hormuz becomes far more dangerous than it might have been a decade ago. A single attack on commercial shipping, a temporary blockage, or a rapid military escalation could immediately trigger oil price spikes that ripple through almost every major economy on Earth. And the frightening part is that global markets often react emotionally before governments even respond officially. Traders do not wait for perfect information. They react to fear, probability, and uncertainty. That means perception itself becomes a weapon during geopolitical crises. If markets believe escalation is coming, the economic consequences begin before the actual conflict fully unfolds. That is why both America and Iran are carefully controlling public messaging right now. Their words are not random. Every statement is designed to influence expectations. When American officials speak about protecting navigation routes, they are reassuring allies and investors and global markets that trade flow will continue. When Iranian officials warn against foreign military pressure, they are signaling strength to domestic audiences and regional partners while also increasing psychological pressure on Washington. This is strategic communication operating in real time. And behind all of this is another uncomfortable truth. Many countries around the world no longer fully trust the stability of the global system. Some nations believe American influence is weakening. Others believe regional powers are becoming more independent. Some governments are trying to avoid choosing sides entirely because they fear becoming trapped between competing global blocs. So, whenever a crisis like this emerges, countries quietly begin calculating their own future positions. China watches oil security closely because its economy depends heavily on energy imports. Russia watches how Western alliances respond under pressure. Gulf states evaluate their security relationships. European leaders worry about energy prices and inflation. Even developing countries far from the Middle East feel anxiety because economic shocks eventually affect food prices, trade costs, and currency stability worldwide. That is why geopolitical crises today spread psychologically across the planet within hours. Information moves instantly. Financial markets react instantly. Public fear spreads instantly. And governments are forced to make decisions under enormous pressure. Now here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Sometimes leaders themselves are trapped by the narratives they create publicly. When governments make strong statements repeatedly, backing down later becomes politically difficult. Domestic audiences begin expecting toughness. Opponents test credibility. Media cycles intensify pressure. Social media amplifies every development emotionally. Suddenly, even small tactical decisions become politically symbolic. And history shows us that some of the world's most dangerous escalations happened exactly in these moments. Not because leaders originally wanted massive war, but because the cost of appearing weak started influencing strategic decisions. That is why military communication channels remain critically important right now. Even adversaries often maintain indirect contact during crises because misunderstandings can become catastrophic. One radar error, one unauthorized strike, one false assumption or one emotional response from a local commander could rapidly create consequences neither side originally intended. And this is especially true in crowded strategic regions like the Gulf, where naval forces, drones, surveillance systems, and regional militias operate simultaneously under extreme tension. People online often imagine war as a clear, organized event that begins with official announcements and obvious intentions. Reality is usually far messier. Escalation often happens through accumulation. Small incidents build pressure. Retaliations create cycles. Political leaders become trapped by momentum. Allies demand responses. Public anger grows. Financial markets panic. Eventually, situations that initially seem manageable suddenly become extremely dangerous. That is why experienced geopolitical analysts focus less on emotional rhetoric and more on mechanisms of escalation control. They ask different questions. Are diplomatic channels still active? Are both sides signaling limits? Are military deployments defensive or offensive? Are regional allies encouraging restraint or confrontation? Are economic actors preparing for prolonged instability? These indicators reveal much more than dramatic headlines. And right now, the indicators suggest something very important. Both America and Iran still appear aware of the enormous cost of losing control completely. That does not mean the danger is fake. It means the crisis exists inside a fragile balance where pressure and restraint are operating simultaneously. This is the uncomfortable reality of modern geopolitics. Countries often prepare for conflict while negotiating at the same time. They threaten publicly while communicating privately. They build military leverage while searching for diplomatic exits. And from the outside, this can look contradictory or confusing. But in strategic terms, it is actually common behavior during high-stakes international crises. Another major factor people underestimate is the role of domestic politics inside both countries. France, leaders do not make decisions in isolation. American administrations face pressure from Congress, military advisors, allies, media networks, and public opinion. Iranian leadership also balances internal political factions, economic pressure, ideological expectations, and regional credibility. Every decision must survive internal political realities as well as international calculations. That is why compromise becomes extremely difficult even when both sides privately want stability. Concessions can appear politically dangerous at home, and because of that, negotiations often move slowly while public rhetoric remains aggressive. Now add technology into this equation. Modern conflicts are no longer fought only through tanks and aircraft carriers. Cyber warfare, satellite intelligence, drone systems, artificial intelligence analysis, and digital propaganda now shape crises in ways previous generations could barely imagine. Financial systems can be targeted digitally. Infrastructure can be disrupted remotely. Information campaigns can influence millions of people instantly online. This means the battlefield of the future is partially invisible. So, some confrontations happen without explosions at all. And in the current US-Iran situation, cyber operations may already be playing a significant role behind the scenes, even if the public never sees the full extent of them. Another issue is that regional actors outside America and Iran may unintentionally influence escalation. Allied militias, independent armed groups, or regional political movements sometimes operate according to their own motivations. A local attack carried out by a smaller group could suddenly force larger powers into confrontation, whether they originally wanted it or not. This is one reason Middle Eastern crises become so unpredictable. Multiple layers of actors exist simultaneously, each with separate calculations, loyalties, and incentives. And when tensions rise, controlling every player becomes almost impossible. That uncertainty alone makes global markets nervous. Investors hate situations where outcomes cannot be modeled clearly. Businesses can adapt to bad news if it is predictable. What destroys confidence is unpredictability. If companies cannot estimate shipping safety, oil costs, or regional stability, they reduce investment and increase defensive behavior. That slowdown eventually spreads economically. So even before bullets fly, uncertainty itself becomes economically damaging. This is why global leaders constantly emphasize stability during crises. Stability is not just a political word. It is an economic necessity for the modern interconnected world. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson hidden inside this entire situation. The world today is so globally connected that regional tensions no longer stay regional for long. A naval incident near Hormuz can affect fuel prices in Asia, manufacturing costs in Europe, inflation concerns in Africa, and stock market volatility in America within days. That interconnected reality makes every major geopolitical confrontation far more serious than people realize initially. The next 48 hours therefore represent more than a simple military countdown. They represent a test of whether global powers can still manage crises inside an increasingly fragile international system. Can deterrence prevent escalation? Can diplomacy survive political pressure? Can economic interest outweigh emotional reactions? Can leaders avoid being trapped by their own rhetoric? These are the real questions shaping events right now. And the answers may define not only this crisis, but also how future global confrontations unfold in a world where power is becoming more fragmented, technology more dangerous, and economic systems more interconnected than ever before.